there, this video is a quick tour through the Model Employee Handbook that we compiled at the Agricultural Justice Project. This is one of the most popular resources in our Farmer Toolkit, and you are free to adapt it and use it on your farm. An employee handbook is essential for communicating your expectations and workplace policies to your employees. Some of this is required by law, but it also gives you the chance to set yourself up for successful relationships with your workers. Our model handbook is designed to get you up and running quickly with a lot of fair labor policies that satisfy the AJP's Food Justice Certification standards. These standards are a response to the injustice and power disparities that farm workers routinely face. They're also a tool for building solidarity between workers, farmers, and customers. If you want to use this handbook for your farm, just see the link below and go to the Google Doc. There you can make a copy that you can edit on Google Docs by going to File, Make a Copy, and then choosing where on your Google Drive you want to put it. Or you can download the file to edit on your own computer by going to File, Download, and choosing the format you want. See the video description below for links to the handbook and other resources that I'm going to mention in this video. As you follow along in the handbook, you'll see that there are blanks and brackets and other phrases in bold type. Those are the parts that you're going to want to fill in with your own details. Okay, so we have to make a disclaimer. This video and this handbook are not legal advice. We at the AJP are not lawyers, and we have not consulted lawyers in writing this handbook, although the sexual harassment section was written by a lawyer. So with that said, there are a few things we should say to set the frame for our handbook and how we're encouraging you to relate to your workers. The first is, if you have looked at other employee handbook templates, almost all of them are written by lawyers and human resources professionals for state extension services. Their primary concern is legal liability of the employer, so they repeatedly hammer language about at-will employment and employees can be fired at any time, and the handbook is not a contract with the employee. This language is all an effort to prevent employers from being held liable in case an employee is fired and then sues for discrimination. The idea is that if you say an employee can be fired for any reason, then that's that. You made no commitment to them, and hopefully a court would agree with you. Suppose you don't say all the disclaimers and you fire a worker, that worker files a lawsuit, and then a judge interprets something you said as a contract or at least an implied contract. In that case, the court might side with the fired worker and decide that you fired them for a discriminatory reason. This is the scenario that these lawyers are worried about. We at the AJP see this as a problem because it's intimidating to be told repeatedly when you start a job that you can be fired for any reason. Our whole message is that for a farm to be fair, farmers and workers do need to make some commitments to each other and have healthy, collaborative relationships. Intimidation has no place in that picture. Food Justice Certification standards actually require that an employer only fire a worker for just and sufficient cause, and employees have the right to raise concerns, negotiate the terms of their employment, and lodge complaints without reprisal. Our handbook includes this policy right near the beginning. A lot of the handbook after that is devoted to specifying what your expectations of workers are, your policies against discrimination and harassment, what processes you have for conflict resolution and discipline. This way, your workers have an idea of what exactly just cause means, the standards by which they'll be judged, and what recourse they have if they disagree. We also still include a provision that you can have a limited probationary period at the beginning of employment where you or the worker can decide to terminate the relationship for any reason. It's not that you can't enter into an agreement with workers. You can, and employers do it all the time. Being clear and upfront about how workers will be evaluated is basic fairness. We didn't write this handbook with the primary goal of preventing lawsuits, so if you're worried about getting sued, our handbook is probably not for you. If you're concerned about a dispute with a worker being hard to resolve, you should know that the USDA funds agricultural mediation programs, in every state. As a farmer, you can request mediation services for free or cheap. But the issue as we see it is that too many employers allow vague fears about possible lawsuits in a very small number of cases to shape their actual relationships with all workers. We think that that's acting in bad faith and reinforces unjust power dynamics between employers and workers. A second thing to mention is that our food justice certification standards generally go above and beyond the bare minimum of the law. We've written the policies in this handbook to be in compliance with federal law and with the most common state laws governing farm workers, but much of what we describe aims at a much higher standard, which is satisfying our food justice certification standards. These standards were written by a range of stakeholders with strong leadership from farm workers and community-scale farmers, and they're widely considered a gold standard for fair labor practices on farms in the U.S. Please be aware, farmers are not required by law to follow all of the policies that are in this handbook. This is a voluntary standard that we're encouraging you to commit to. Our third disclaimer is that while we have tried to cover all the bases of federal law and most state law, laws vary by state, and there are definitely some laws that aren't addressed here. New laws covering farm workers have been written in various states, including minimum wage and overtime laws, parental leave, paid sick leave, and so on. Ultimately, you are responsible for making sure that you're in compliance with the relevant federal, state, and local laws. So do a little more homework and get help from a local farm organization or your state extension, or from Farm Commons, which compiles information on all the laws covering farmers in each state. So like I said, we're not lawyers. This video and this handbook are not legal advice. That said, let's talk about how we make your farm a more fair place to work. Our hope with this handbook is that the policies here can help you build work relationships of mutual respect and cooperation. One part of that is that you, the farmer, commit to proactive communication, to respectful, fair policies, and to managing in a way that values everyone and their contributions. The other side is inviting your workers to be engaged in their work and invest in the farm, to help offer more sustainable livelihoods for everyone involved. So, without further ado, welcome to our employee handbook. First, the introduction sets the tone, so you can use this space however you like, share some of your farm story, general info, or values and expectations. The section Agricultural Justice includes the most important rights that are covered under food justice certification standards, as well as some legal requirements. So the first one of these is just cause, followed closely by freedom of association. As the handbook says, we will not fire an employee without just and sufficient cause. Employees have the right to raise work-related concerns, negotiate the terms of their employment, and lodge complaints or grievances without any employer reprisals. This farm recognizes employees' freedom of association, meaning that workers can negotiate with management on an individual basis, in small groups, or collectively. All right, so next up, you probably already know this, but the law forbids employment discrimination and sexual harassment. The non-discrimination clause says which classes of people are protected by the law. The sexual harassment section is much more detailed, explaining what harassment is, what an employer has to do about harassment, and what employees can do to file a complaint or seek help. So here you're going to fill in the details of your state attorney general office, as well as the regional equal employment opportunity office. These 3 pages get a little long and legalistic, but we strongly recommend that you use this policy as it is and read through it with your employees. Next up is conflict resolution. So this is a policy we adapted from the Olympia, Washington Food Co-op. As the handbook says, conflict is inevitable when people work together. So this is the process that we'll follow to try to resolve conflicts and maintain an enjoyable, productive workplace by speaking respectfully, using basic nonviolent communication, and active listening. This guidance here is pretty brief. Really, skillful conflict resolution benefits from more attention and practice. So we highly recommend that you practice conflict resolution and your process with your crew. We also highly recommend the Courageous Conversation protocol that Soulfire Farm has shared with us, which we link below in the description, along with a couple other general resources on conflict resolution. Next up is a progressive discipline policy. That just means that the policy outlines a process with multiple steps of increasing severity. In the rare case that someone does something really serious, the policy allows for a worker to be immediately dismissed. It's important that you keep records of discipline on your farm so that workers can know exactly where they stand. FJC standards also require you to allow a worker to have a representative of their choice present for disciplinary meetings. The section on layoffs lets your workers know how layoffs and rehiring decisions are going to be made based on the farm's labor needs, the workers' skills, seniority, evaluations, and so on, as well as how much notice you're going to give before a layoff. Our standards require at least 7 days notice, preferably more. The whistleblower section tells workers their rights under the Occupational Safety Act. Namely, that they have the right to report injuries and file complaints without retaliation. This section also repeats that workers have the right to raise concerns and seek better working conditions without retaliation. Workers on food justice certified farms also can bring grievances and complaints to the AJP and to their farm's certifier. The next section outlines your general expectations of your workers and any mutual commitments you want to make to build the kind of workplace that you want to have. Most of this section is really familiar territory. Just, the work is hard, be prepared, be diligent, and be on time. I'll mention 2 points that are raised in the behavior section. The first one is the discussion of workplace community agreements, asking everyone to commit to being respectful and attentive to relationships. You can definitely be more specific than this. And for these to be really community agreements, you should involve your workers in writing and revising these agreements from time to time. The second point is the discussion of harassment. This is just a more plain language way of making the same points from earlier, that harassment and mean behavior are not going to be tolerated. The next section covers the nitty-gritty details, so the conditions of employment. That means the documentation required, your work schedule, overtime, reviews, and if you opt for it, a probationary period. As far as schedule goes, there's no requirement in the AJP standards that says work has to start or stop at a scheduled time. So farmers still have the option for a flexible schedule to respond to weather and other unforeseen circumstances. What the AJP standards do require, however, is that any hours worked beyond 48 hours per week are voluntary. You, as the farmer, can still ask workers to work beyond 48 hours in a given week, but they can opt out without penalty. They also have the option of at least 1 full day of rest every week. If workers do work overtime, our standards don't require you to pay time and a half, but federal law does require time and a half beyond 40 hours if a worker does anything in a week that exceeds the legal definition of a farm laborer. So, for example, that can be packing produce, selling at market, making deliveries, and so on. This varies a lot from state to state based on the State Department of Labor interpretation of federal law. But there is plenty of advice from farm organizations on federal overtime law and state interpretations, so do make sure that you're in compliance. AJP standards require that each employee receive at least 1 evaluation per year and upon request. We recommend you consider evaluations as a 2-way process, an opportunity for you to share feedback and appreciations with your employees, but also an opportunity to hear feedback on your management and on possible improvements to your farm operations. We feature some links below if you'd like help improving evaluations at your farm, and we're including an excellent handout from Soulfire Farm on their Real Talk process. When you do evaluations, be sure to keep records of the conversation with important points raised and follow-up steps. Keep a personnel file for each employee if you don't already have one, and there you should keep records of evaluations and reviews, records of trainings, notes about discipline, and so on. AJP standards require that employees have access to their files on request, although you can set a time that works for you as long as there's no unreasonable delay. Meetings and trainings have to be paid work time. This part of the handbook is a good place to let employees know what trainings they should expect. AJP standards require trainings in worker rights, both legally and under food justice certification, as well as health and safety. The Federal Worker Protection Standard requires annual trainings for all employees if you use any EPA-listed pesticides or chemicals, including OMRI-listed. Pay and benefits. We recommend you provide your workers with the pay notice and work acknowledgement included at the end of this handbook, which outlines pay rate, pay schedule, nature of the work, and so on. You're required by law already to provide your workers with written documentation of some of these items. If you're a farmer in New York State, you should really use the official New York State form, which is linked in the handbook, which satisfies new laws covering farm workers in New York. Living wages, as opposed to minimum wages, are the pay rate that lets a worker live decently and provide for their dependents. That means a living wage covers adequate nutrition, clothing and sanitary needs, healthcare, childcare, transportation, housing and utilities, and, in our definition, savings. Living wages are calculated for local conditions according to the cost of living and for different household sizes. We link to MIT's living wage calculator, but you should also note we suggest you add 10% to MIT's calculation in order to cover a worker's savings. Our FJC standards require you meet one of two scenarios. One, you already pay all your workers a living wage as calculated for your area. Or two, you can't yet afford to pay your workers a living wage, so you share enough of your accounting with your workers in order to demonstrate why you can't afford living wages yet, and you come up with a plan to improve your profits and cover higher wages, and you also commit to raise wages as your profits go up. You may not be required by law to have workers' comp, disability insurance, or unemployment insurance, depending on what state you're in and also how large your farm business is. However, FJC standards do require you to have all three. Providing health insurance for your workers is not required, but I'll just note it can be really helpful for an employer to help employees connect to healthcare resources. So for example, that could be providing the contact information for your local community hospital, and especially the patient financial advocate, who often help people to get signed up for insurance. Note that sick leave and parental leave policies have changed in some places. The federal COVID-19 emergency sick leave policy has expired, but note that sick leave may still be subject to new laws and emergency orders. Health and safety. Safety is obviously important, but what's also important is communicating about safety. We have various resources below to help you make a health and safety plan and to train your crew. But I'll also just note a few things here. First, you're required by law to provide your workers with personal protective equipment that's appropriate to the work that they have to do. It should also fit them well enough to be practical. Second, FJC standards require ongoing safety discussions. On smaller farms, these can just be informal check-ins at regular meetings. For farms with a bigger crew, we recommend you form a health and safety committee that includes workers and management to proactively respond to safety concerns. Third, we require safety trainings that address all the hazards on your farm. Keep records of these trainings so you can make sure that everyone gets the training they need. Fourth, as of filming, the COVID-19 public health emergency is still not over, and new emergencies may be on the horizon. Keep an eye out, as always, for public guidance on how to keep your workers and your customers safe. Up next is food safety. As a farmer, you're probably familiar with legislation around food safety. This section is a good place to introduce your workers to your farm's food safety plan. So this brings us to the end. Here you can share important contact information with your employees and get their emergency contacts as well. The final pages are the pay notice and work acknowledgement that I mentioned earlier. If you have any suggestions, or if you have your own ways of addressing the issues that we bring up here, please do share them with us. This handbook has been developed by farmers, and we would love to share your insights too. Thank you so much for following along. If you did find this handbook useful, you might also appreciate the rest of our Farmer Toolkit, which has lots of resources to help your farm develop fair relationships with your workers as well as with your customers.